Hello, hello. This is Justin Colletti of SonicScoop. Thanks for joining me for this week's episode of the SonicScoop podcast. And today, it's going to be all about how to EQ everything. The concise guide, totally for free. This is going to be a concise guide, unlike the super long guide I just did. Those of you who've been following this channel probably know that we released the EQ Breakthroughs course very recently. It came out just about a week ago. At least 100,000 people have heard about it, probably more, and thousands upon thousands have bought it. So if you're a student of the course, much appreciated. EQ Breakthroughs is like 8 or 9 hours, super deep on EQ, from foundations, fundamental conceptual understanding of how to use EQ, as well as mini masterclasses on how to EQ every single instrument in every single genre. But today, in 30 minutes or less, or your money back, I'm hoping to give you kind of an overview, like a free version of the course. For those of you who took the course, don't worry, the course is still like 8 hours way more awesome than this, but it could be great review and overview for you. And for those of you who aren't in the market for a full-length course, I just want to give you some of my general thoughts and best guidelines and best practices around EQing. If you are not familiar with me and this channel, why should you listen to me? I don't know, you shouldn't listen to me, you should listen to records and you should listen to how your EQ sounds. But I have been doing audio for more than 2 decades. I've worked with gold and platinum selling artists. I've got gold and platinum plaques and all that stuff. And I've, even more importantly than that, have studied the work for the past 15 years of the best producers and engineers out there, interviewing them, producing masterclasses with them, picking their brains and trying to figure out the common threads about how they work. So yeah, I think I can give you an oversight based on all that stuff, and also based on me mastering for clients for years now and coaching people. I get on coaching calls. We do the mixed feedback sessions here. If you want to become a member of the SonicScoop YouTube channel, it's super cheap and you can get personalized mixed feedback. And I've seen what the most common problems are for people and what kinds of reconceptualizations, reframing, and what specific tips and tricks and ideas seem to help them the most moving forward. So I hope this one can be useful for you. Before we get into how to EQ everything in every genre and every instrument and all that stuff, I just want to give you a sense for what we're going to be going over today. So it'll be a really brief view of each instrument. I'm going to bring up the Pro Tools screen now and then so you can see some ideas of what EQ moves might look like on different instruments. And I just want to give a synopsis on each. We're going to start with drums. We're going to bass, acoustic guitars, electric guitars, synths, and I'll make notes about what to do on different genres. Before we get into all of that, I just need to, hey, that's not my good looking screen. Where's my good looking screen? There's my better looking screen. Before we get into all of that, I just need to give the briefest shout out to our sponsors. This is a free podcast because we have sponsors. And the most important sponsor is you. How do you sponsor this podcast? Consider becoming a member of the channel. $5 a month, you get access to live Q&A sessions with me, guaranteed answers to your questions. You get access to the mixed feedback sessions. But the best thing to do is sponsor by investing in yourself and sponsoring yourself. Check out one of our great full-length courses like EQ Breakthroughs, Mixing Breakthroughs, Mastering Demystified, Compression Breakthroughs. All of them are guaranteed to change the way you work forever for the better or your money back. There is absolutely no risk in taking them. And last but not least, quick shout out and thanks to our other brand sponsors this time around. We've got Ultimate Support Stands. They are sponsoring right now. This Shure SM7B I have here is on this BCM 300 Deluxe Broadcast Mic Stand. It is the best designed and the best built desktop mounted stand I've yet run into. I've had a ton of Ultimate Support Stands over the years. They make really great stuff, just really high quality and cost-effective brand. So when you need to get a lot of good mic stands that aren't going to break on you and that you can have for years and years, Ultimate Support have been one of my choices and probably one of my top choices for decades now. So big thanks to those guys for sponsoring. Also, a big thanks to Sound Toys for sponsoring once again. This is your last chance to win the whole Sound Toys bundle. Go over to sonicscoop.com/contest for your chance to win one of 3 chances to win their whole Sound Toys 5 bundle. Absolutely amazing set of tools. And we also are, we have another giveaway. Go over to Plugins Masters. These are some new friends of ours who are selling plugins at incredible discounted prices, and they are giving away about $15,000 worth of free plugins. Check them out at pluginsmasters.com. and check out their giveaway there. I'll be linking to that in the description in the show notes down below. Also, if you want to try out any of the SoundToys plugins, you can do that over at soundtoys.com. All right, let's get back into the meat of this before we dive in and look at some EQ settings. Just want to give you some concepts. First of all, drums. How to EQ drums. Man, drums are interesting because they are probably one of the most heavily EQ'd instruments that there are in modern styles of music production. When it comes to really modern rock, hyped up electronic pop, that kind of stuff, anytime you have a real recorded drum kit, there's usually a lot of processing going on to make it sound the way that it should. Close mics are often EQ'd like crazy, and you can see really significant moves on things like close mics for kicks and snares. This is especially true when you have modern styles of music production with real live recorded drum kits. We'll talk about specific EQ ranges in just a moment that you want to look at. But ironically, on some of the most processed styles, some of the heaviest heavy rock and metal records, some of the most banging club tracks, electronic tracks, hip-hop tracks in general, a lot of the EQ doesn't necessarily come from EQ that's going to happen in your mixing session. So many modern styles of music are either using samples, sample enhancement, sample augmentation, sample replacement, or just sample drums to get sounds. So bear this in mind, that if you're working with organically recorded drum kits for really modern styles, they often want a lot of EQ, and sometimes a lot of EQ isn't enough. Sometimes using samples to augment or replace sounds is what's going to get you all the way there. And in the course, EQ Breakthroughs, we have a whole bunch of audio examples to give you a sense for what EQ can and can't do, how far you can take things with EQ versus sample replacing. We give you some strategies and ideas there. There are, of course, other styles of music production that have a more laid-back approach to drums. But even in those styles, drums are going to tend to be one of the more EQ'd instruments. Now, to really talk about EQing drums, we have to talk about so many different things because there's so many different drums in the kit. Each one of them could potentially have a different kind of treatment. And in different genres, drums can have different kinds of treatments. Like the kind of EQ curve you would get for a metal drum kick or a hard rock drum kit is very different than the EQ curve you might wind up with for a kick drum in a hip hop record or an EDM record. So this is something to be aware of. Also, EQing raw, unprocessed drums that you recorded is a totally different beast than EQing drums that you might have gotten from a sample library. Even if it's one of these great sample drum libraries where we're emulating real players, those are often, to some degree, EQ'd and processed and brightened up. So the approach to EQing already sampled processed drums can be very different from the process of EQing drums that you're recording yourself. All right, let me open up the screen as I illustrate some of these ideas. There's a whole bunch of great EQs you could be using. I'm bringing up a few here. There's really fun analog ones like this CQ from SoundToys. So simple and really fun to use, just low, mid, and high. You don't even know necessarily what frequency you're selecting for every band. But EQs like this can be really fun and really intuitive and a great way to reshape things. For today's purposes, we could look at EQs like the Plugin Alliance Kirchhoff EQ or the Fab Filter Pro Q3. Both of these are really similar and they have great graphical interfaces. Things like there are EQs from Mic DSP that work this way. There's a great Isotope Ozone EQ that works this way. So there's so many great EQs in this family. We can just grab one of these at random and take a closer look. Now, for something like kick drum, what we're often looking to do is cuts in, this is for rock kick drum to start with, we're often going to be looking at kicks probably in the low mid-range, cuts in the low mid-range. So on a kick drum, cutting somewhere between 200 and 500 hertz, this is one of the most common things to do on traditional rock and pop kick drums, as well as looking for boosts in the upper mid-range. Now, depending on the kick, sometimes kicks want a little bit of sub-frequency added to them, but some kicks are actually going to want to have you take some sub-frequencies away from them. But not an uncommon curve to look at on a kick drum could be looking for some type of upper mid-range boost between, say, 2K and 6K, some type of low mid cut, probably between 200 and 500, and maybe boosting lows anywhere from 60 hertz to 100 hertz, or cutting some of these low frequencies. Exactly what to do where is so context dependent, and in the full-length course, EQ Breakthroughs, we have so many audio examples to give you the idea for which direction you should go on any particular kit and just how far to go. There are going to be some styles in which huge boosts in the upper mid-range could be extremely common. We could be doing boosts here. I have 9 dB boost here, right? We could be doing boosts and cuts of 9 and 10 dB on kick drum. This is entirely possible. And on certain records, that could sound awful. And doing similar boosts and cuts in similar places of, 2 or 3 dB could be more appropriate. Learning to hear exactly how far you should push it, what exact frequency areas, again, context dependent, genre dependent, and the best way to get that is with lots of practice. And one way to practice is EQ a lot of different stuff in a lot of different genres yourself. Another way to do it is go into a course like EQ Breakthroughs and EQ a whole bunch of instruments along with me and hear how far we can take things. Get feedback from someone who's been EQing stuff for more than 20 years about how far I would take in this style compared to this style. But these are some of the themes that are going to come up again and again. Some of the most important frequency ranges to look at in kick drum. Now, one of the things I can't help but talk about when we talk about kick drum is the interplay between kick and bass. And most often, you're going to want to have one of your bass instruments, either kick or bass, be the lowest in the mix. So it's helpful to think which of these elements is going to be more dominant in the sub-bass area, frequencies, say, below 100 hertz, and which of these elements, kick or bass, is going to be more dominant in the upper bass region, say, frequencies from maybe anywhere from 80 hertz to 200 hertz. And there's so many different ways to break up the frequency spectrum. And I go through some very systematic approaches about how to do that and about how to think about and hear the frequency spectrum in the course. But just to keep it quick today, there's a chance that on one type of kick drum, you want to be maybe a subbier kind of kick drum. There's more sub energy and less upper bass. On a different type of kick drum, it might be the kind of kick drum where you want to have an upper bass accent and the subs aren't as important. Now, do you have to radically reshape every single kick drum that you get? Not necessarily. And that is less and less the case in, ironically, the styles that are the least processed. So if you're doing folk and jazz recordings that are meant to sound really organic and natural, maybe you're doing less EQ. But ironically, also in the most processed genres, hopefully, if you have an electronic track or a hip hop track, you don't have to EQ the thing like crazy because the producer did great sample selection. And if they didn't, sometimes it could be your job as a mixer to do some sample augmentation. Whether that's your role on the specific project is totally something we could talk about at length in another podcast episode. But these are some ideas around kick. We'll talk a little bit about kick again when we revisit bass and common areas to EQ around bass. But this very same frequency curve that we're looking at here for kick drum, where we're often boosting up some lows, cutting low mids, and boosting upper mids, this is a recipe for so many different sounds. This is something that's done on so many different elements in the drum kit. If we were EQing toms, it could be really common, again, to cut low mids, boost upper mids on toms, and maybe find a low frequency to boost on toms. Maybe not, depending on how much resonance, how much bottom end we want out of those toms. It is also possible on things like kicks and toms to look at boosts higher up in the frequency spectrum, closer to 8K, our lower high frequencies. And these are areas you can sometimes have welcome boosts in, but you can potentially run into issues, especially when we're not talking about samples, where boosting too much in this area can give you too much cymbal bleed. And there's so many ways around that problem, how to deal with that problem, how to get hyper-real, impressive sounding drums that have the clarity and the brightness and the crispness and the articulation you want without having to deal with crazy, annoying cymbal bleed. And we talk about some strategies for how to deal with that in the EQ Breakthroughs course. But again, this same general thing that we're looking at for kick, we could look at for toms as well. Snare drum, it can again be similar, except the big difference is our fundamental on a kick drum could be somewhere between 40 hertz and 80 hertz, depending on the size of the drum. whereas our fundamental lowest frequency on a snare drum is likely to be somewhere more like 100 to 200 hertz. And sometimes it can be beneficial to boost the lowest fundamental on the snare, and sometimes it can be beneficial to cut it. Which one is the case for your particular snare drum? Again, context dependent, and it takes a lot of listening exercises, I think, to get it right. You can also look at boosting areas in snare that might be similar to what you might in a kick drum, but often the center mid area starts to become more important in certain types of snare drums. So where it's very common to look at boosts from, say, 2K to 6K in the upper mid range on a kick drum, sometimes the boost that some producers and engineers prefer might be lower down into the center mids. But again, context dependent, drum sound dependent, and we have a whole bunch of EQ examples in the course to kind of get that idea home to you. Now, let me go back to just our main shot here for a second to just talk a little bit conceptually about EQ when it comes to overheads. This is something we have a whole module just about overheads and room mics and drum buses in the course. And we have a whole bunch of listening exercises that get you into the place where you're starting to really differentiate each of these general frequency bands so you know which ones to immediately go for and grab. And that's where I think so much of the benefit comes from and why I'm not afraid to share these EQ numbers, because a lot of these numbers that we're looking at, ranges we're looking at, this isn't the first time you're going to hear this advice in these areas. And it's not the last time you're going to hear it either. But what's going to make you stop asking so much is the experience and the ears on ours and a good conceptual framework for approaching how to EQ. And that's what we go into more depth and detail on in the course. But one concept I want to give you right here, right now, is about EQing overheads. And this can totally change your approach to EQing overheads, because you may have heard the advice, very contradictory advice from people of, number one, hey, don't EQ your overheads too much. You should get the body, the whole sound of the drum kit from your overheads. And you're just supporting that a little bit with your close mics. That's one approach to overheads. You might hear totally the opposite advice, though, which is the overhead should be more like cymbal mics. And they can kind of like muddy things up. And honestly, in modern styles of production, I don't want to hear a bunch of low end and low mids in my overheads. I want them practically to be cymbal mics. We might go into our overheads in some modern styles of production and be like, hey, what are we doing with all this stuff below 200 hertz? Let's go ahead and turn this into a low shell filter. Let's just get rid of a whole bunch of this stuff. And let us go ahead also and put in a high pass filter here and cut out some of our subs. And you might see people treating overhead mics like this, where they're really reducing significantly frequencies from low mids and below, and maybe even cutting out subs completely. That sounds like a totally different concept than the advice of, let's get our main drum sound from the overheads and then just add to it. So which one of those is right? And the answer is yes. They are both potentially right, but they are two dramatically different approaches to EQing drums that apply in different contexts, different styles, and different mic techniques lend themselves to different approaches with EQ. I would say, in general, the more modern and hyped up the style is, and the more that you want to hear specific precision on each and every element in the kit, the more that idea of using, say, something like a spaced pair of overheads as almost cymbal mics, and then adding in close mics and getting so much of your sound from close mics, heavily EQ close mic, that are maybe sample supported, that is potentially the way to go. But there are other records, beautiful sounding records, where it's like about one mic capturing the whole kit. And that's our bass drum sound. One of my favorite producers who I've interviewed a bunch of times, Gabe Roth of Daptone Records, did all the Sharon Jones and the Dap King stuff. He would often like to take a single mic, not even the spot kick drum mic or anything, a single mic, put it in exactly the right place to get the whole kit feeling right and be like, that's our drum sound that we're basing everything else around. And it could end up being a really weird mic. There's a story I tell in the course of the day that Nigel Godrich, producer, engineer, producer for Radiohead and Beck, came into a studio I was working at, and we got the sense for what he was doing on this particular project, where he was using a single overhead mic. And I give more details about this in the course. Single overhead mic that captured basically the entire drum sound, augmented by a single mic inside the kick drum. And there again, it was about getting the tone off of one mic. But you really have to know what kinds of records, what kinds of styles lend themselves to one approach or the other. And that's something we can go into more detail on another day. But just know there are two potentially radically different approaches to doing overheads. Now, we're 20 minutes in. We've covered the basics of kick drum, of toms, of overheads, of snare. I could start going into rooms and drum buses. I think that I'm going to save for the course because there's so many different examples in there and there's so many different ways to treat room mics. Are you using your room mic as a Led Zeppelin When the Levee Breaks kind of thing where the whole kit is meant to come from those room mics and it's supposed to sound darker and fatter than the norm for, modern radio rock records? Or are you going for a sound like the room mic is just supposed to accent and enhance and broaden out the snare drum? Totally different approach to EQ. But we've just been talking about kits right now. We haven't even started talking about electronic music or hip hop. So what are some of the differences there? Some of the EQ curves I've been showing you right now have just been harping on this old school idea of miking up a drum set and then EQing it. But on a hip hop kick drum, these low mid areas that we might cut on a metal record or a heavy rock record to get a really clicky, coherent, attacky kick drum, these same frequencies, 400, 500 hertz, that you might cut in a rock or metal kick, you might want a whole bunch of this in a hip hop kit. On a hip hop kick drum, you might want 300 hertz, 500 hertz, 600 hertz, 800 hertz. This whole low to center mids area, this could be an important part for you to get some body out of the drums. So you might not be doing these huge cuts in the low mids. You could even boost. And in certain types of hip hop, you wouldn't necessarily be looking for our 4K and 5K and 8K EQ boost to brighten things up. Maybe we're looking for a crunchy frequency in the center mids that's really bringing the kick drum forward. And then, of course, on a hip hop kick, we probably almost certainly wouldn't want this high pass filter on here, right? Let's just completely turn that off. And who knows? Maybe we want to add in some more bottom below 80 hertz or below 50 hertz to our hip hop kick. Electronic kicks are similar, but different. They share a little bit in common with hip hop kicks and a little bit in common with rock kicks in that you don't necessarily need to EQ an electronic kick like crazy, just like you might not need to EQ a hip hop kick like crazy, because hopefully sample selection did the job. But generally speaking, hip hop kicks will want more lows and subs loaded into them, and EDM kicks might not. And every once in a while, to make the low end sound bigger on an EDM record, I actually have to cut some lows out of the kick so that it becomes more forward. And maybe we're looking for a mid-range boost on an electronic music kick. And maybe it doesn't happen in this super clicky 4K and 5K region that you might find on a metal or modern hard rock kick. Maybe it happens a little bit lower down in the 2K or 1K region. But the big difference for me with hip hop and with electronic compared to rock is just how much sonic variety there is in kick drums, how much we want to respect the kick drum sample that was selected for the record, and how much we want to, instead of answering the question with EQ, if things just aren't working, it's not the right kick drum sound, it's not the right snare drum sound, instead of going in there and EQing it like crazy, like we might on a rock kick, of just saying, was the right sample selected? Do we need to go back a tick? Is this song not working because of sample selection? And whether or not you're the person to make that decision depends on whether you're a trusted mixer for them, whether you're actually the artist or the producer. But if you find yourself EQing drums like crazy on a kick drum, on a hip hop or an electronic record, maybe start thinking, should I be EQing like crazy? Or am I trying to solve a problem with EQ that should be solved with sample selection? So not every EQ problem, ironically, can be solved with EQ. All right, I hope some of this stuff is making sense to you guys. Now we need to go on to our next instrument. Oh man, I could go on a huge deep dive, an hour-long deep dive right now on electronic music snare drums and on hip-hop snare drums. And again, there's so many different kinds. But in the course, I give you examples and I give you the context that you need to make some of these decisions for yourself. Often, hip-hop and EDM snare drums can be a little bit more mid-rangey and constrained than rock and pop snare drums can be. But again, super deep dive on that with audio examples in the course. I want to keep on breezing through to give you some more broad concepts. Our next big instrument here is going to be bass. Let me check how I'm doing on time. Man, we are already 25 minutes in. I've gotten through drums. We're going to have to start cooking with gas. I'm going to go through bass. I'm going to go through at least guitars and keyboards. And I think my notes for you on acoustic guitars are going to be really important. My notes for you on piano are going to be super useful for any of you who are ever dealing with pianos. But bass is another one that a lot of people have a lot of trouble with. So let's focus on that for just a little bit. All right, let's go over to screen share again. All right. When it comes to EQing bass, again, you want to ask yourself, what genre am I in? What style am I in? Because there's such a big difference between getting a classic rock bass sound versus a metal bass sound versus a hip hop bass sound versus a jazz fusion bass sound. And you really want to know what makes sense for your style. The first thing I'll lead off by saying is that what's going to change the most genre to genre is how the low end is handled and what specific area in the mid-range of the bass that we're likely to boost to try to get some detail and audibility out of the bass without just making the thing boomy. Because one of the big problems here with bass is if we just turn up the level of the bass and make it louder, there's often so much low end in a bass that it starts to overwhelm the rest of the mix. It makes things sound too muddy, too boomy, and if we turn the thing down, it starts to get lost. So on most of your favorite records, the reality is that often low end gets taken down on basses, but this doesn't always happen with EQ. One of the most common things to happen on a bass in a rock or pop context is for there to be some type of multiband or parallel compression being used where the low end is often compressed more heavily than are the mid-range and the upper frequencies. And what that does, just the fact that so many mixers, like by default, compress their lows more than the rest of everything else, is that this has the effect of kind of just taking down the lows a little bit, which has the effect of, by comparison, raising everything above the lows a little bit. And this is one of the interesting things with EQ. If I come over to here to 300 hertz and I start bringing down 300 hertz by 3 dB, and then I turn that up, this has practically the same effect as if I go in with the appropriate slope and boost everything above 300 hertz and don't turn it up. We get to the same place. And this is one of the crazy concepts about EQ that you start to realize the more you use it. You can sometimes make 6 different EQ moves to get you to a sound that one single EQ move could have gotten you to. Or you can do 2 totally different EQ moves that get you to the same place. Just like going in here and cutting my lows below 300 and turning it up, going to have a really similar effect if I have the right slope selected of boosting above 300 and not turning it up. So where our audibility comes from in bass is in the mid-range. And we almost always need some boosting somewhere in the mid-range to get enough mid-range detail of the bass for it to be heard on smaller systems. So if you're dealing with this issue on bass, where you boost it and it's too boomy and it overwhelms everything, you turn it down, you can't hear it. The problem is most likely the balance between the mid-range on your bass versus the low end on your bass. Now, rather than just doing broad boosts and cuts like this, a good thing to look at on bass is which specific area of the mid-range does the bass want to live in? And this, again, is genre dependent. I'll tell you really quick that on rock records, often somewhere between about 800 hertz and 1.5K, somewhere in this area, that's where you're going to be looking to boost to get some of that mid-range definition you want out of the bass so it can cut through the mix, be audible, be present without being overly bright. But there are other styles of record. There are some records where if you want more of like a 90s jazz fusion sound, then boosting up here in the 2K region, 3K, 4K, even sometimes weird little boosts in the 8K region. The more that you're looking at this upper mid-range area, and maybe even some of our lower highs, the more that we're getting this kind of string noise, like string articulation off of the bass. And it really transforms into a very different kind of bass. Play around with this yourself. Play around with what a really big boost sounds like in the upper mid-range from, say, 2K to 4K, and just contrast that and compare that to a boost from 800 to 1.5K, somewhere in there. You'll hear one sounds like a rock bass, and one sounds more like you're summoning Victor Wooten or something. It's a very different style and feel. But then if you want like retro old school funk bass, sometimes you want to take some of these muddy low mid frequencies and boost them. You could end up boosting 300 hertz, 400 hertz, 500 hertz on a bass if you want a retro old school funky tone. By contrast, on a rock bass, that same, like a modern rock bass where maybe we're boosting around here 1K, we might also do a significant cut. If I can find the right frequency, here we go. We can do a significant cut maybe around 400 or 500 hertz. So an EQ curve like this in the mid-range might happen on a rock bass. In addition, though, to finding the right spot to boost in the mids, and again, there's tons of examples that are kind of genre-based in the course EQ Breakthroughs. We can hear a lot of the stuff together with me. I'll push it too far so you can really hear it. Then we'll back off and we'll do a whole bunch of listening exercises so you can figure this stuff out. But if you want to really play around with this stuff and really master EQing bass, you're going to have to figure out not just the mid-range relationship, which is possibly the most important thing on bass. You're also going to want to figure out how the low end is supposed to sit. And this is counterintuitive, but sometimes the way to make your low end sound bigger is to get rid of some low end on one of your low end instruments. If you've decided that you have the kind of song where the kick drum is supposed to be this big, woofy, massive, bottom-heavy thing, to get away with that, that might require that either your bass is tucked way down the mix or you just go for a brighter, tighter bass sound. And you have the kind of record where you have a bright bass sound and a big bottom-heavy kick. And to do that, sometimes rolling off your lows, rolling off subs, or it doesn't have to be this extreme with a high-pass filter. We could use a shelf to take down some stuff below a certain area. Sometimes doing a little bit of this, low cutting, can be useful on bass. But there are going to be other bass sounds where you're going to want to do the exact opposite. Instead of doing cuts here, some bass sounds are really going to lend themselves to having a big boost around 60 hertz or around 80 hertz, and the bass really wants to live there. Often in these cases, those are going to be songs where the bass is meant to be the big, low, throbbing thing, and the kick drum might be a little bit more of a tight nugget, or the kick drum could be a little bit buried compared to it. And again, we look at examples of how to approach these. You can also have the approach of puzzle piece EQ, and this is not always necessary or required, but when people hear me talk about this concept of make room in the bass for the kick and make room in the kick for the bass, they immediately go to, oh, does that mean I should boost, say, 80 hertz on the bass and go in and cut, say, 80 hertz on the kick drum, and we'll have these two EQs next to each other, one on the bass, one on the kick, and one's cutting that area, one's boosting that area. Is that what you mean? And the answer there is like, maybe sometimes that could work, but it's not always that. You could even end up in a situation where you're boosting 60 hertz on your kick. Here's a 60 dB boost of 60 hertz on the kick. And you're boosting, 60 hertz on the bass, but it's a 1 dB boost of 60 hertz on the bass. Both of them needed a little bit more low end. But on a relative basis, you're adding 5 more dB of 60 hertz to the kick, and you're only adding 1 more dB of 60 hertz to the bass. So on a relative basis, you've increased the amount of low end on the kick relative to the bass by 5 dB. So you can still be respecting this concept even when you're boosting on both instruments. It really comes down to first getting an understanding of what's the role that each instrument is supposed to be playing. Is one of them supposed to be more dominant than the other? Because this is another thing us mixers get ourselves into trouble with. Man, we're going off the beaten path here for a second. I get so freeform on these live streams. It's not like structured like the courses is, or like the courses are, I should say. But I want to hit you with this concept because sometimes as mixers, when we're getting into this stuff and we're getting started, we have this obsession with, I need to make it so that everything's heard equally well at all times. How do I make it so I can hear both my kick and bass equally well? And sometimes this idea of puzzle piece EQ, of we're cutting lows on a kick and we're boosting lows on a bass, or vice versa. We're cutting 500 hertz on the kick and boosting 500 hertz on the bass, whatever it might be. That idea, we get obsessed with these things, how to make them both clear at the same time. But sometimes in the song that you're working on, it is okay if the bass is louder than the kick and the bass is the dominant low-end instrument and the kick is secondary. And on some songs, it's okay if the kick is the dominant low-end instrument and the bass is secondary. It's okay if your main instruments in this mix are, hey man, it's really about what's happening with the vocal and the bass, and then secondarily the snare, and then the kick is kind of second fiddle to all of those. That's okay. That's more of a concept for mixing breakthroughs and some of the things we really explore in course or channel members mixes when we do mix feedback sessions. We're always listening for that. We always love to listen to references to tune our ears and say, hey, on some of our favorite records, what are the most dominant instruments in this section? What are they prioritizing? Hey, on all these records you love, their most important drum on this style and this tempo is the snare, and you've made your most important drum the kick. Did you do that on purpose because it served the song, or are you doing that just because you wanted to see if you could make the kick drum audible because you're getting into mixing and engineering and you feel like you should be able to make kick drums loud? Was it the right choice for that song? Man, super big important things to think about and to listen for that are honestly more important than your EQing. That said, EQing is super important and super fun, so let's talk about it a little bit more. So many different ways you could approach EQing bass, again, depending on genre and depending on how your kick sounds and the role it's supposed to play in the song. Now, again, we're doing a live stream here, and I try to go into these a little bit unprepared and freeform and just kind of go where things take me in real time. But in the course, we have it really structured, really scripted, and there's a systematic process and approach that I think is going to be really conducive to you finally figuring out how to do EQ. Because it's not just a whole bunch of random tricks and examples strewn together. It's not like this. It's not like this idea of here's a bunch of instruments and here's the most important EQ plate for horn, the boost 3K for bite, boost 8K for brilliance, cut 500 hertz for honkiness. Like it's not just that. It's a whole systemic approach for how to think about EQ, how to listen for EQ, how to know what you're going for, and how to systematically go in there and apply it and come up with a repeatable process to using EQ that you can do consciously at first. And then once you've done this conscious process a bunch of times, it becomes second nature and your second guessing about EQ goes away. And I'll show you the exact steps that I took more than a decade in to being a professional in audio to really be able to understand and immediately hear any instrument or any mix and be able to immediately pick out, oh, this track needs actually a little bit more 700 hertz with like a wide, a bell-shaped filter, maybe a dB. And how do I know that immediately? It's not because I sat around memorizing specific frequencies. I did get really attuned to understanding the difference between frequency ranges. And there are in the course 7 different frequency ranges that I suggest that you really master and understand. And if you can quickly identify what these 7 frequency ranges are and how they sound and what the role is on each instrument, then your EQ making decisions become so much faster. And we have some listening exercises to get you there so fast. I really believe that if you can differentiate between these 7 bands without thinking about it, you are going to be in better shape than about 90% of people professionally working in audio at EQing. And I say that because I was in audio for years professionally making a living at it before I could reliably do that. And I know a lot of great mixers today who can't name specific frequencies, whether it's 395 hertz or 402 hertz, they don't know. But they know the general area that they need to affect. So they don't think in numbers, they think in ranges. And that's something I want to encourage you to think about too. I throw out the numbers because it's easier to be specific that way. And I know that you know what I'm talking about. But once you go through the course, I'm much more inclined to talk to you about ranges rather than specific numbers. But that's a concept that I need 5 or 10 minutes to really give you guys. So let's stick with talking about numbers for now. All right, going on to our next instrument. And that is going to be, this one's going to be so helpful for you guys to hear about. Man, since we have such limited time in this live stream, I get so bummed because I start talking about EQing bass and I just want to talk about for an hour because I have more than an hour's worth of stuff to tell you about EQing bass. And if I want to make it less confusing for you, I really need you to give me 30 minutes to 60 minutes on any of these instruments to not just talk about and not just look at curves, but also to hear them. And if we can spend that time together, I just know you're going to come out transformed on the other end. But I have to give the short treatment now. I have to give the YouTube surface level. Here's the 5-minute EQ tip that's going to change the way you EQ bass. I'm trying my best to do that across a whole variety of instruments. But the deep dive is really what makes it stick and really what allows you to internalize this stuff. These are the kinds of things I say, by the way, when people who don't like my videos, they go, he's just talking a lot. It's like, man, you need to find out what's important. And like, there's no way for me to let you know how important it is to actually do the appropriate critical ear training, listening, kind of focused listening that you need to do. There's no way for me to stress that to you without repeating myself and saying that you have to do it and encouraging you to do it because it's so vital. And it's something that is so different than watching a 5-minute video on when EQing bass, you should boost in the mid-range. And you know what? That frequency should be 1.5K. It's noise. Although 1.5K can be a good frequency to boost on bass, again, depending on context. All right, acoustic guitar. This one is super important because acoustic guitar is one of the most brutally murdered instruments of any instrument in most beginner and intermediate mixes. And it's one of these things that's so difficult to EQ. And some people do a little bit of the right thing, but not enough of it. And some people do a little bit of the right thing, and then they do too much of it. Conceptually, acoustic guitars, you first need to figure out what role is the acoustic guitar playing and what kind of section are we in. Because if we are in a really sparse section of a song where it's a vocalist and an acoustic guitar and maybe like a single like low throbbing kick drum, and that's all there is in the entire mix, that acoustic guitar can be EQ'd entirely differently than an acoustic guitar that's in the middle of a really up-tempo, dense chorus section where there's a Hammond organ and an electric guitar and a full drum kit and a synth pad and a synth lead and all this other stuff going on and a vocal and all the stuff. Two totally different approaches to EQing an acoustic guitar. In general, in more sparse sections, you can have bigger, fuller-bodied, more impressive sounding acoustic guitars. And in general, in more dense sections with more elements going on and in more up-tempo songs, you generally want thinner and brighter sounding acoustic guitars. So, bringing up our screen share here again. If we were EQing an acoustic guitar, let me set this back to the factory default here, we might be looking at, cutting out some low frequencies. Maybe we're doing a high pass where we cut out some of the extreme lows. Maybe we're doing some type of low shelving filter to get rid of some of our lows and low mids. And maybe we're trying to add some more brightness and sparkle to the guitar in the upper frequencies. Maybe you really love the way 8 or 10K sounds on this acoustic guitar and you're trying to make it even prettier by boosting somewhere there. Maybe the acoustic guitar is too muddy and you want to cut somewhere here in the low mids between 300 and 500. So maybe something like this, and probably with a bit of a broader bandwidth in here, is maybe something you do on acoustic guitar. And this could be exactly the thing to do on an acoustic guitar in a really dense section. But although conceptually this makes sense, sometimes this is wrong. Because sometimes by making your acoustic guitar too bright and now boosting too much between whether it's 4K, 5K, 8K, 10K, whether it's the upper mids or the high frequencies, sometimes boosting too much up here will have this unwelcome effect of bringing the acoustic guitars too far forward in the mix. And this is a problem I hear again and again on new and beginner mixes, is that they will hear the advice of, hey, sometimes you want to cut some lows and low mids out of acoustic guitars, particularly in a dense mix. And sometimes you might want to add more brightness to it. So they just go and do that, and they end up going too far in that direction and getting acoustic guitars that are in front of the vocal in their track. When the vocal is supposed to be the most important element in this song or in this section, they have the vocal, as far as depth of field, back here further away from the listener, and the acoustic guitars super close up to the listeners, in front of the vocalist, when you're thinking about depth of field. And this might be exacerbated by the fact that on the vocalist, they're putting some delay and reverbs, but on the acoustic guitars, they're totally dry, and that brings them further forward still. And with the acoustic guitars, maybe there's two of them, so they're hard panned. So you have these hard panned acoustic guitars that are way forward in the mix, totally dry, and then behind these hard panned acoustic guitars, you have the vocalist, who's supposed to be the most important thing in that section, sitting behind the guitarists in the soundstage. Conceptually, does that sound like the way things should present in a mix? And start listening for that in your own mixes and see if possibly you're doing that. So sometimes what you want to go with, not always. This is sometimes. This is context dependent. This is what's happening in the mix. What's the style? But sometimes you could be benefited by getting rid of low end and getting rid of some high frequency on your acoustic guitar. Before adding a whole bunch of 8K and 10K and pretty sparkly sounding stuff to your acoustic guitar, ask yourself, why am I trying to make this acoustic guitar sparkly? Is it because the acoustic guitar sounds pretty that way? Or is it because it's making the song sound better? And here's something I wish I said near the beginning of this live stream, because it's so important. It does not matter whether or not the EQ moves that you are making make the instrument you're EQing sound better. Let me say this again. When you're EQing the acoustic guitar, it does not matter whether or not the acoustic guitar sounds better. What matters is whether or not the song sounds better, is whether or not people are more emotionally connecting to the song, is whether or not you're featuring and highlighting the right elements in the song. And you could end up with the prettiest, biggest, most sparkling sounding acoustic guitar in the world that sounds like a featured acoustic guitar should. But the problem is the acoustic guitar shouldn't be the featured element in that song, in that section. And every last extra ounce of sparkle and shine and shimmer and impressiveness you give to the acoustic guitar detracts from that in the vocal, or detracts from it in the snare drum, or makes it so our piano sounds cheap or our synth sounds small. Maybe it's wrong. Maybe the stuff you're doing to make the acoustic guitar sound better is making other things in the mix sound worse. So this is a huge concept in the course, which is sometimes the EQ moves you're making, it's not about what they're doing to the instrument you're EQing. It's about what those EQ moves are doing to other instruments. Conversely, sometimes to make your acoustic guitar sound better or sound more featured, if it should be, it's not about EQing your acoustic guitar to sound any different. It's about EQing other elements that are in the way of your acoustic guitar. Are you trying to boost a lot of upper mids or high frequencies on your acoustic guitar because you can't hear the detail of it in the mix? Maybe. If so, is that happening, in fact, because it's being masked by all the low mids or center mids in the drums? Or is there some synth that's covering up the acoustic guitar? And once we EQ that synthesizer to get out of the way of the acoustic guitar, now the acoustic guitar comes forward without us touching the acoustic guitar. So I'm going down the rabbit hole on a concept here, but principles for acoustic guitar specifically. Yes, often in dense sections, we're cutting lows, and sometimes we even might want to brighten up top. But every once in a while, you might want to think about, sometimes you could have a mid-rangey acoustic guitar sound that sounds less good in isolation, sounds less impressive when you solo it, but works better in the mix. And I give you one example in the course where you can hear that transformation for yourself, where I make the acoustic guitar sound objectively worse in solo, but it works way better in the mix. And not because it makes the acoustic guitar sound better, but because it makes everything else around it sound better. So contrast and context is so important when it comes to mixing, and when it comes to EQ in particular. All right, other elements to talk about. I really feel like we're getting, I meant to make this like a 30-minute live stream, and now here we are at almost 50 minutes. So we'll talk really briefly about vocals, electric guitars, and synths. And we'll talk a little bit about mix, bus, and mastering. Can we do that all in like 10 minutes? I think so. I'm going to give you really focused, really concise ideas on them. And if you want more depth, they're all in the course EQ Breakthroughs. Now, to keep this podcast free, what are the things I've got to do? I've got to shout out sponsors one more time because we're getting near the end of this episode. So, biggest, most important sponsor, as always, you. Think about sponsoring yourself by becoming a member of the YouTube channel. It is right now, this is so stupid, it's $5 a month. You guys who are members, if you're in the chat right now, let me know how much it should cost to new people. I'm going to grandfather all current members in at $5 a month for as long as I can get away with it. But for new members, I'm going to have to think about increasing the prices soon because it's ridiculous for $5 a month. The access that you get to live mix feedback. I mean, the mix coaching sessions that I do that cost close to $200 for an hour, where I do mix coaching sessions for people. Right now, it's $175 for an hour with me on a mix coaching session. You want me to master a single, it's $135 a track right now. If you want me to master an album, it's lower than that because on a per track basis, it's lower for albums. But for $5 a month, I do these epic 3-hour-long live streams where we listen to all the different mixes from all the different people, and then we talk amongst each other about what, if anything, could be improved. We first lead with what's really working in your records and what you should double down on doing. No matter what level you're at, we're always trying to find for you, like, what are the things that you're doing right? What works? And then we're looking for what's your lowest hanging fruit? What are the areas you can improve? What are the specific things that we can do? For $5 a month is ridiculous. If you're a member, tell me what I should charge new members when I raise the prices. Should it be $10 a month? Should it be $15? I mean, the mixed feedback sessions and the Q&As are great, and there's exclusive videos for you guys, so check that out. Also, we've got the full-length courses, Mixing Breakthroughs, Compression Breakthroughs, EQ Breakthroughs, and Mastering Demystified. Each one of these is super deep dive, and unlike a little live stream that I do, they're super well structured. I really put a lot of heart, soul, and I hope intelligence and into these so that they're programmed in a way where you go through the course once and you will be changed for life. And that is the feedback I get on these again and again. So there's a 30-day money-back guarantee on them. Check out EQ Breakthroughs at eqbreakthroughs.com, Mixing Breakthroughs at mixingbreakthroughs.com, Compression Breakthroughs, compressionbreakthroughs.com, and Mastering Demystified. Also, quick shout out before we get into these last few items and how to EQ them is Sound Toys, one of my favorite plugin companies in the known universe. We are last day right now. Go over to SonicScoop.com/contest for your chance to win the whole Sound Toys 5 bundle, or just go over to soundtoys.com whenever you're listening to this and just get the 30-day free trial to the whole Sound Toys 5 bundle. It's absolutely amazing. There's some of the most fun effects to use. Things like the crystallizer, the super plate, the Echo Boy, the decapitator, the CQ, the radiator. An EQ like the CQ, you should have an EQ like this in your arsenal, where it's just like lows, mids, and highs. And maybe you adjust the mid frequency you're boosting and cutting, and try EQing that way for a while. Man, super useful way to think about EQing. So check these guys out. Their new super plate is awesome. Also, big shout out and thanks to Ultimate Support, making, I think, some of the best values in stands out there, where there's guitar stands, mic stands, they have speaker stands, they have this broadcast desk-mounted stand I'm using right now. Ton of great stuff, and they just have really tremendous quality for the price. I've been using their stuff for ages, and I literally have some Ultimate Support stands that I've had for a couple of decades. So, good stuff. All right, now, are there any other? Oh, shout out one more thing. Plugins Masters, they are giving away, I'm actually going to put this into the live chat right now. If you're on the live version, and if you're seeing the replay, it should be in the description. They are doing a giveaway. They're a relatively new plugin sales company that have been around for a year. I met the guy who owns it, Leroy, really sweet guy. He has good connection with all these plugin companies, and they are hooking him up with the ability to give away almost $15,000 worth of free gear. So pretty awesome. Big thanks to Leroy for sharing his giveaway with us over at pluginsmasters.com. Check him out. Some great values on plugins. Let me go back over to my screen share, and I will go ahead and pop this link into the live chat for those of you who are on the live chat. Check that out. Actually, did I give the full link? Let me see here. You can tell this is live, right? There's a little code at the end of it. Maybe I should have put in this one that has a little code at the end of it. Bam. Okay. Back to EQing. All right. Pianos. Really similar in concept to what I've been talking about so far around acoustic guitar. In your denser sections of songs, they generally want to get brighter and thinner and clearer. And often you could be cutting out really substantial amounts of low frequencies and low mids on pianos when you're in really dense sections and up-tempo sections of songs. You really do not need much here in the low mids of, 300 hertz, 200 hertz, 400, like all this stuff. You can get rid of a lot of it. And you can get rid of a lot of lows, all the stuff below 200 hertz. The denser the section, generally the brighter you're going to want it. Depending on the style, the piano part, how bright it should sound, you might again be looking for places to boost in the upper mid-range. And you could look for boost in this 2K to 4K area, or you could potentially look at boost up here in this 8K to 10K area, or maybe a little bit of both. This is an EQ curve we've seen before, and we're going to see it again. However, sometimes in these dense sections, things can get too strident, too bright, too annoying. So there are going to be occasions where you want a piano sound that's a little bit more intentionally, I don't want to say lo-fi, but more intentionally mid-forward. And sometimes if you want some of the detail and audibility without all the brightness, looking at boosts in this 1K area could make sense on an acoustic guitar or on a piano. These are potentially areas to boost. So don't think you can only ever boost upper mids and highs on piano because that's like the classical thing people tell you in the handbooks. Like sometimes the boosts want to be here in the center mid area. And there are going to be times where you want piano sounds that really have a softened top, whether that's with a high shelf to kind of soften the top a little bit, or in some cases you could even use a gentle high cut or low pass filter to really get rid of stuff above 8K or 10K. If you want a piano sound that is light and constrained on the bottom, let me change this one to a low pass filter, but also has detail, has focus, has not much weight on the bottom, but isn't too sparkly. You could end up with a mid-rangey piano sound that goes something in this general direction. So there's not one right way to go. Piano moves can also be very minimal and much smaller than this. Maybe you're just rolling off some extreme lows, say below 30 or 40 hertz, where there's just maybe some pedal noise. Maybe you're actually boosting some stuff in the lows, just cutting out a little bit of the boxy lower mid-range around 300 or 400 hertz. And maybe we're going ahead and trying to make the piano a little bit more sparkly up on top, boosting a little bit of stuff above 8K or 10K and finding a little bit of an upper mid-range spot to lift. An EQ curve like this, where we're boosting lows a little bit, but cutting out subs, reducing boxiness in the low mids a little bit, but getting some more clarity and articulation and detail out of our upper mids and a little bit more sparkle and prettiness and air out of our high frequencies. That could be a way to go, possibly in a piano that's in more of a sparse section where the thing can really kind of spread out and breathe a little bit. So again, knowing which approach to go for, when and where, can be huge. And we're looking at these approaches again and again of either sometimes amping up lows and highs and cutting low mids, really common to do on mic'd up instruments. But another variable I want to give you, we talk about in the course and we show examples on, is that sometimes you don't need to amp sounds up, and sometimes you don't need to brighten them. Sometimes they're plenty bright, and this is especially going to be true for you people who are using more virtual instruments than you're using microphones. The more that you're using microphones, the more likely it is that you're going to have to do some carving of low mids and boosting of upper mids and highs on certain instruments. But the more you're using virtual instruments, the more you might run into situations where they put a ton of 8K and 10K and 4K on that sound because they want to win in a quick sip test. They wanted their drum library to jump out of the speakers and impress you. So there's a ton of 10K on all the cymbals. And you might have to go in there and do the opposite of some of the things that I'm talking about. I've been talking about brightening up your overheads. Maybe they already did that for you on the sample library that you're using. Maybe you need to go in and soften the high frequencies and bring down some 10K on your cymbals and hi-hats on a sampled drum kit, because they were already adding tons of that stuff for you, having made these EQ moves already and having gone really, really too far with them just to impress you in a quick sip test. When you're just hearing the thing in solo, sounds great, sounds impressive, sounds brighter and bigger than all the other drum libraries. But you might need to counteract that. Oh man, vocals. How to EQ vocals. Quick notes. We're going lightning round now because I'm running out of time. I want to keep this thing under an hour, and I want to see if I can still do that. With vocals, sometimes you want to cut subby low stuff. Often there will be on a lot of vocals from, I find one of the mistakes that newer mixers make a lot is sometimes leaving in too much of this chesty low stuff around 200 or 300 hertz, particularly on male vocals. Sometimes this stuff will be too uncontrolled. So often looking for places to cut in the low mids on vocals can be useful. Every once in a while, of course, you want to boost them, but look around 200 hertz and see if the vocals overemphasize there. 200, 250 can be a place to cut. Every once in a while, you might want to boost extreme lows on a vocal, like 50, 60, 80 hertz on some male vocals. It's uncommon, but can be useful. And it is pretty common to brighten vocals in the present range, somewhere in the upper mids, and in the high end, somewhere in the high frequencies. Exactly where depends on genre and style, but I'll give you a quick thing here where male vocals more often tend to lend themselves to boosts in this 3K and 4K upper mid-range area more, where female vocals tend to lend themselves to boosts more in the high frequencies, 10K and 12K more. And when it comes to boosting highs, with male vocals, I'm more likely to reach for a boost in the lower highs around 7 or 8K, whereas in a female vocal, I'm more likely to look for boosts in the upper area highs of maybe 10K or 12K. So exactly where we boost and cut vocals depends a little bit on genre, with those boosts and cuts happening, not surprisingly, a little bit lower in frequency on male vocals. Whether we're looking at our lows or low mids or our highs and upper mids, often our boosts are going to be slightly lower on average on male vocals and slightly higher on average on female vocals. But most vocals need to get brightened up from the way that they were recorded, unless you're recording on a very bright microphone. And some of you are. So sometimes you might need to address areas where your vocal might have way too much 7 or 8K on it, because that's just how the mic sounds, and you need to actually reduce some of that 7 or 8K area because of all of that sibilance. And sometimes it's not about EQing 7 and 8K. Sometimes it's about keeping the brightness in 7 or 8K, but adding a de-esser to it. And a de-esser is kind of like a dynamic EQ. It's a frequency-specific compressor that's going to control our S's and T's in that 7 or 8K region, but not bring it down overall. All right, we've just surpassed an hour here. Darn, I've totally failed at giving you a under an hour masterclass on this stuff. So I'll just give you a couple quick notes. Electric guitars, we generally EQ them less than acoustic guitars. Hopefully you got the sound right at the amp, and sometimes reamping is a more useful approach than EQing if the sound really isn't working. You can sometimes bend over backwards with EQ, and it's not going to do the same kind of thing that reamping or tone selection is going to do, although we show some examples of both in the course. Some similar concepts. Oh, high percussion is another one, like acoustic guitars. Sometimes they're way too bright in people's mixes, and I hear beginner mixes that have way too much 10K in their cymbals. They get too happy with this idea of boosting high end in overheads, and they boost it too much. And like the only thing that has 10K in it is their vocals and their cymbals, and everything else is dark by comparison. Then it goes into mastering, and you want to make everything have a little bit more clarity, but you can't because of how much there's a ton of 10K on the vocal and the cymbals relative to everything else. So that's something to watch out for. Another quick note here is about mastering EQ. And I do a whole little spiel here on mastering EQ in the course. But there are basically 4 distinct shapes of mastering EQ. 4 different cardinal directions that you can go with any sound. And this applies the most when it comes to mastering. Does it need to get brighter? Does it need to get darker? Does it need to get more hyped up and more scooped? Does it need to get more focused and more mid-rangey? First, knowing which direction a master needs to go in. And also, we could talk at length about mix bus EQ and what you'd be trying to achieve by EQing the mix bus instead of the individual buses. I hope this has been a good primer for you guys. I'm looking at your chats as they come in, and I'm going to read them all before once I end this live stream. I'm not going to answer questions today, but our next members only live stream is going to be happening at the end of this month, where you will get guaranteed answers to any questions that you guys ask in the chat. So if you want to partake in that, click the join button at the bottom of this video here on YouTube. If you don't see that join button, it's probably because you're on an Apple iOS device, in which case you may have to go into the description and click the link there instead, because they don't let you join directly from the iOS apps. So hopefully I'll see you in there. But if you've liked this, if this has been useful and you've gotten some insights from it, dude, the course is so much better than this. It's so much better structured. Every single one of those modules is planned out in advance with everything I've ever wanted to tell you about each one of these instruments. We're going to take a dive of this length into every single instrument, hear a ton of audio examples, and really hammer the stuff home. And there's so many great listening exercises where even if you just do the first 90 minutes of the course and just do the listening exercises and the conceptual and technical portion, I guarantee the way that you hear and use EQ will be changed forever, just in the first 90 minutes. Compression breakthroughs is the same way. It's front loaded, where if you do the first 90 minutes of compression breakthroughs, the way that you hear, understand, and use compression is going to change forever for the better. And then all the stuff after that really hammers this home and gives you the requisite ear training experience you need to leapfrog in your abilities pretty immediately. A lot of you folks writing in now, I will read some of the compliments coming about the course. Isomatic says the course is phenomenal. Ant-Man Felix says, smash the like, please do. House Music asks, link to the course. It's so easy. It's eqbreakthroughs.com. I'll type it in here for you. eqbreakthroughs.com. https://. So it's right there in the chat, eqbreakthroughs.com. For those of you who are listening afterwards, not in the chat, it'll also be in the description. If you're more interested in compression breakthroughs, we've got that too. AJ says mixing breakthroughs was good also. Ant-Man Felix says the EQ stuff is gold. I want to get mastering demystified and or mixing breakthroughs at some point. You should. Mixing breakthroughs is one that has really changed the way that people have worked. There's a lot of compliments here in the course. Oh, big thanks to House Music for giving us a super chat here. Big thank you to House Music. We got a super chat in here for $2. I appreciate it. It's really the thought that counts. Mr. 2 Beats just became a member. Welcome. So glad to have you as a member, 2 Beats. I'm really excited to see you in the Q&As and the live streams. Some more comments here. Music 7 Studio says, being able to seamlessly go between dynamic and parametric EQ is great for workflow, I think. Aaron Miller says, as a drummer, thinking about the why behind EQ curves feels like a huge concept. Yes, so big. Know what you're trying to accomplish. And that's one of the things we go through in our process for EQing, is the first step is to listen and ask ourselves, what, if anything, needs to change? I want you to get out of the habit of mindlessly EQing things based on advice that you've gotten on the internet. Based on, someone told me this with a good, I was told that I should boost 8K on snare drum and also on vocal and also on the, it's not necessarily about specific frequencies. And this is one of the other things I want to get you into. Like, whether you boost 8K or 7K, given a sufficiently wide bandwidth, doesn't really matter that much. But knowing that you should be boosting in the lower highs and not the high highs and not the upper mid-range, that is big. The lower down in frequency you go, the more granular, the more it matters. There's a much bigger difference between 60 hertz and 70 hertz than there is between 10,000 60 hertz and 10,000 70 hertz. 10,000 60 and 10,000 70 are basically indistinguishable for all intents and purposes. 60 and 70 are possibly distinguishable, but pretty darn close. But more important than getting right whether you boosted at 60 or 70 is the idea of, should I be increasing my sub bass on this or my upper bass on this? Which of those areas do we need more in? Hey, another member here, new member just joined. C. Colletti. I hope I'm saying it right. Either C. Colletti or C. Soletto. Welcome to the membership. Really glad to have you here. Hopefully, we'll see you in the next members only Q&A and the next mixed feedback sessions. Omniburn writes in and says, I'm going to buy all the courses. I would so love that. You guys can get deals. If you buy all the courses at once, you will get a huge discount on them. Even if you just buy one course and want to add on a second, you get discounts for bundling any two of them together. So If you really like the idea of both EQ breakthroughs and compression breakthroughs and you think you're going to buy them eventually, you just buy them both at once now and you get a discount for buying both. There's also the breakthrough bundles that gets you EQ breakthroughs, mixing breakthroughs, and compression breakthroughs. There's also the mix and master bundle that gets you mixing breakthroughs and mastering demystified. And there's like the ultimate bundle that gets you everything. So there's discounts for all of you guys if you're looking to get more. All right. I could talk about EQ for another 8 or 9 hours. And I do in the course. EQ breakthroughs, if you want, with a ton of structure and a ton of audio examples. So great to have you guys here. Thanks for joining me for this episode. Big thanks again to SoundToys, to Plugins Masters, and to Ultimate Support Stands for sponsoring this episode. Big thanks to you for sponsoring. And if you don't want to buy anything, I hope this was useful for you. You don't have to buy anything to get my love. We've got hours and hours and hours and hours and hours of free videos on this channel. And bless you too if you don't want to buy anything. All I ask is if you made it this far and you're not buying anything, please do hit the like button, hit the subscribe, and maybe if it was this useful to you and you got this long, share it. If you never want to buy anything from me, but you get this far in one of my videos, that's like the best way you could pay me is give me a like, a subscribe, a comment, and more importantly than all of them, a share. Share them with your friends. If they really helped you, they could help other people that you know. So thank you so much for being here and spending an hour of your day with me. It's important to me that you could be anywhere else and you chose to be here with me. Thanks again for hanging out with me. This has been Justin Colletti of SonicScoop on the SonicScoop podcast. See you next time.